Genetic method and unity and dichotomy. So I've grouped together a couple of fairly vague philosophical topics that will keep coming up. So again, we want to try and get clear on them early. The genetic method. I'll just read out the bit of writing I've got at the bottom here, because there are two different things, related things that I refer to with the genetic method. The genetic method is the research approach used by Vygotsky to reveal the essential nature of particular psychological functions by bringing them into being in an experimental setting or tracing their formation and disintegration in the course of natural development. Okay? So, Russell, you were just telling us about an example of genetic method there, weren't you?
Wait.
About that early book? Yeah. Okay. So you have, for example, there's to me, I think the greatest single contribution that Vygotsky made to science was this method that really departs quite spectacularly from the objectivist ideal of science. That he would take, typically say, a child who was involved in a task, and instead of sitting, behind a glass wall with a stopwatch or something, he would offer the child some sign or object to help them complete the task, and that was the essential act. Okay, it's elaborated in 100 different ways. So the idea was that if you do something that brings a certain insight, ability, or whatever, where you bring about some development of a psychological function by introducing something into the child's activity, then you learn something about that psychological function. Right? So it's an experimental technique. Instead of just simply asking someone, what is a piece of furniture? Is a chair a piece of furniture? Is a curtain a bit of furniture? Whatever. And then compiling the tables and say 51% of people think furniture includes curtains. This is the kind of work that present-day psychologists waste their time with. Being interested in the social problems to which psychology is addressing itself, such as the massive inequality reflected in the education system. He wants to understand how learning takes place and what is the nature of learning. And so what he does, he creates a kind of microcosm of an act of learning where he actually creates the use of some particular artifact. Might be a word, or might be a little coloured card that is to remind them of something. Okay, so that's the genetic method applied as an experimental method. Okay, we'll come back to this later. Also, you have the investigation of the natural development. So, for example, Luria, who was one of Vygotsky's young associates right back at the beginning in the early 20s, but who fortunately, by very astute political manoeuvring, managed to live until the 70s, whereas Vygotsky did not. Luria became, one of the ways that Luria survived in Soviet Russia was abandoning psychology and becoming a neurosurgeon. And when the war came along, there was plenty of work for neurosurgeons. And quite possibly, if he'd stayed in psychology, he would have been a victim of the Moscow trials. But by moving into neuropsychology and neurosurgery and taking the ideas that he developed with Vygotsky, he basically founded modern neuroscience in the late 30s. And all the brain damaged people that came back from the front during the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War as they called it in Russia, gave him plenty of material to work on. And so one of the things that Luria did was study brain damage, and by looking at how people operate when they lose this or that function, gave him insights into how the mind works. Right? So they started off very interested in child development, looking at how children begin with something like approximating a blank slate and develop into fully developed human beings. By studying that developmental process, they learnt about the mind. Also by studying how the features of the mind disintegrate, either through damage or old age. These are applications of the genetic method. Also, you have investigations of social history. So, for example, if you study the development of people's psychology as society itself develops, then that's another way of applying the genetic method. Okay, so that's the genetic method has these multiple meanings. One is an experimental method. Two is simply a method of observation, like of observing, for example, child development, even without intervening in it through education or something, through observing the historical development and cultural development of human societies. Thereby, you learn.
Genetics, it's not in genes, is it?
No, genetic is simply any Greek scholar here can tell me what gene means.
Similar to the genetic method in phenomenology?
No, there's something different. Genetic method means simply the method that studies how things grow.
Genesis.
The genesis, right, so that's the word, the genesis. Genesis in that very broad meaning, it can be the first book of the Bible, or we can say it's the genesis of a great idea here. Right? It's just how it's a method that studies things in their process of growth and decline. And it can be in two main different contexts. A deliberative thing where, for instance, I know how a car works because I pull one to bits and put it back together again. And because I could put it all back together again, I have a very concrete knowledge of how it works. Okay? A relative truth, but that's the idea. Same way if you work with, say, an older relative and you watch them gradually losing some of their faculties, and you look at their coping strategies and how one particular fault either produces a reinforcing development somewhere else or causes an unexpected fault that's going to... You get to learn by watching things in their development. That's the simple truth. And Vygotsky's method was thoroughly imbued with the genetic methodology. He was not into experiment by observation. It was experiment by through educating people, through rehabilitation of people that suffered injuries, through people who had are deaf or had disabilities, dealing with solving people's problems generates an understanding of the processes lying behind the problems. On the other side, he's interested in historical development, biological development, the evolution of the species, cultural development, the development of societies when they undergo change, and so on as well. These are all part of the genetic method, that spread of interest. And it's the opposite, really, of taking a certain object and then trying to understand how it works simply as it's given to you. Right? So by looking at only at the product of a process, or like a snapshot, we miss the interconnections and functional relations between apparently separate processes which make up the whole. So, for example, you might look at a certain law. The law says you've got to do this, that, and this is crazy, all these qualifications, section B, section D, it makes no sense to me. But the way you'd understand how a particular bit of legislation got to be how it was, you'd trace, maybe over a period of 100 years, how the law started off simple, but then problems came along, exceptions, and the law develops in response to problems that come along. The mind is the same. Right? Things aren't ever simple, because they are the way they are, sometimes very weird and wonderful ways people do things. They're there because they've developed that way through overcoming problems in the past and developing. And it's by tracing that process of development that you can understand things. If you just take a snapshot, like imagine you watch a movie and you just take one frame out of that movie, you can't understand what's going on. Right? You really have to see the whole movie to understand what's happening there. So that's what the genetic method's about. Okay, are we all okay with this?
Seems like a lot of it just seems to be what a good parent would do.
Yeah.
But, so Vygotsky's just theorising good parenting.
Yeah, but he's doing absolutely bad science as far as everyone else in the scientific world at his time, and the majority of people in the scientific world to this day would say. Right? Because the genetic method, which involves not looking at the object, but looking somewhere else to see where the object came about, and actually interfering in the development of the object, these are things that scientists not to do. For instance, you might take there's a department of law, and there's a department of history, and there's probably some character who's got a little department for the history of law, but they're separate departments, right? So you can't understand law except by understanding the historical development of the whole society which brings out a law, right? So that's just taking one example. Genetic method is not the normal approach in science. Right? It comes about in a roundabout way because scientists beaver away at some little problem, but there's thousands and thousands of scientists beavering away, and often the process of development that's going on emerges out of the work of everyone. Right?
I think it's similar to the sort of approach that Darwin would take.
So the which?
To Darwinian science.
Yes, that's right. Well, Darwin is certainly an archetype, standout case of genetic method, that's right. And when he went off to the Galapagos and he sees these birds with different lengths of beak, the clincher is that when he actually observes the beaks of a particular type of bird getting longer. That's right. And it was only when he was actually, even though it was a tiny, tiny little thing, he was actually able to observe that change, that then the sense of the whole process. That's right. It's right. Darwin's evolution is like an archetypal case of the genetic method, quite right. And of course the opposite, the biology as it existed pre-Darwin was Linnaean biology, in which everything was simply categorised taxonomically. Yeah? According to, if you had a bird with a long beak, that was this species, a bird with a short beak was this species. And Darwin said, actually no, both these birds derive a development of another bird, which isn't around any longer, that had a medium-sized beak or something. And he had to prove that. Okay, now for people that are used to Vygotsky, this is really baby stuff, because we already know that we use the genetic method. So I'm going to be a little bit antsy and say there are a couple of problems with the genetic method which we need to watch out for. One of them I call just so stories. Does anyone know what a just so story is? Or am I giving away my age here? No one? Okay, when I was a child, my parents gave me this book by Rudyard Kipling called Just So Stories. And there are things like the Aborigines have a lot of them. How the rhinoceros got its horn and how the giraffe got a long neck, right? And the funny little stories that explain, like the giraffe had a short neck, but then, he got into a fight with so-and-so and he wanted to get the highest branch, so he got a long neck, right? What you find when the genetic method is applied beyond the realm of experience, there's not an experimental method, but for instance looking at historical development, particularly when it moves into the area of history, what you find is that often people take their opinion about the way things are today and say, well, that's because of something that happened in the past. And all they're doing really is projecting the present onto the past. Same as a slightly different example, when people say for instance, in the mid-19th century, one of the justifications for capitalism was given by Darwin, because Darwin showed that the animal world operated by competition, right? Survival of the fittest. Not mentioning the fact that Darwin got the idea from Malthus. So Malthus had a theory about population and competition, and when the population grew to a certain point, competition would kill off the weaker of the species. And also, he didn't say species, he was applying it to population, right? And Darwin thought that's a great idea, that's what's happening in nature. And then the social biologists come along and say, this is what happens in human society, look, that's what's happening in nature. So there's a danger in the careless application of a genetic method to look for a justification of something that's here and now and is subject to observation and study in something that happened somewhere else, like as its supposed origin. Right? And the problems in that book that you mentioned of Vygotsky's, that he wanted to find historical origins for writing, and he kind of put it. It didn't work. It became very problematic because, can't do all the critique here, but there's lots and lots of examples where people stories about, for instance, also like humans are like this are different from animals because of so and so, right? So you try and it's the same kind of problem that really it doesn't matter if humans are different from animals in this way. That how are humans, right? I'll frequently fall myself into the idea of, say, contrasting human beings to animals, for instance, with conditioned reflexes. But then someone will come along, so actually such and such a type of bird or such and such a type of mammal learn just like we do, right?
But they don't develop generation.
Well, I've heard that contradicted as well.
Well, they develop physiologically, biologically, they evolve. But how a dog satisfies hunger?
Look, essentially you're right, of course. Essentially speaking, that is to say, human beings are a species which accumulates culture, that is to say material culture, and how it's used, and passes it on generation after generation after generation, and that's how we got to be where they are.
It doesn't only pass it on, but it evolves. Well,
it evolves, that's right, it evolves.
Evolves suggests it gets better, but
it changes, yes. When a bit of technology runs into a problem, someone solves a problem, and it's changed, maybe better or worse, but it goes on. On the whole, the humans are unique in that. But don't push it to an extreme. If someone says that saltwater seals off the New South Wales coast originated from freshwater seals that were driven out to sea by hunters and learnt to tie themselves up in seaweed to go to sleep at night, and that's gone on for many generations since. I don't have any problem with that. They actually learnt to use a bit of their environment and turn it into a tool for their survival and adapted from a freshwater to a saltwater environment. It doesn't break down my whole theory about human nature because someone's found an animal that, in that sense, behaved like a human being. Right? And I'm perfectly willing to believe that one can find other examples as well. The point is that what's essential about human beings is its cultural historical development. Yeah? So that's why I have just a warning about the genetic method is really the heart of cultural historical activity theory. That is to say, we look at the genesis of things and we understand things that way. But there has to be wariness about projecting ill-formed opinion about the way things are now onto a past and finding a justification in the past for how things are. Okay? The genetic fallacy is a similar thing. This is a logical fallacy, like that says the wedding ring represents the chains of which a woman is bound when she marries a husband. Therefore, I don't want to have a wedding ring. Well, come on, look, the meaning of a wedding ring's changed, okay? Just because it might have historically evolved as representing a chain that a husband puts on a man, that's gone, right? So the genetic fallacy is to presume that the way a thing originated stamps it forever, right? There is a certain value in the opposite of the genetic method, that's to say taking things as they are and looking at their dynamics, right? So that you can't just ignore or write off the way something's operating here and now because of a story about how it came to be. There has to be a sort of bringing together of observation of the way things actually are working, which makes sense of its genesis, and got to make sense of each other. You say, oh, now I understand why things are working like that, because here's how it evolved in the past. And when your observation of how something works sort of melds with good, well-founded basis about how something's evolved, then that's a good grounds for having a theory. But you need to mix in that way. Okay, genetic method on its own can lead you astray because it's leading you away from what's immediately given in front of you. Of course, when the genetic method is applied to the experimental method, or it's implied in working with children as they develop, that's not a problem, right? But genetic method, when you're, for instance, calling about history or calling about comparisons with the animals, these kind of things where you're moving outside the area of experience, there can be problems. Are you okay?
That's why I think Chad's stronger than Vygotsky analysis or Vygotsky analysis, because sometimes I'm just not convinced by those genealogical critiques because they seem very convenient.
Yeah.
And like you said right at the beginning, that unity of both what might be the ideal with what's the objective facts before us and how they've come together, it kind of forces you to kind of not just project onto it, but reconcile what is with what's been, what might be. So that I like that Gesso story caveat.
Okay, this is a great little diagram. We're going to come up with this diagram in future. A lot of the words I've got scattered around here don't trouble about because we'll get to that later. But what's shown on the red and the left is the development of speech through various stages of development of speech. We're looking at very young children here. And on the right, in blue, you've got the development of thinking through various stages. And what this is showing is that speech and thought forms, concepts, have different origins. Right? That children, the phrase that Vygotsky uses is there is pre-intellectual speech and pre-verbal intelligence. That's to say, at a very young age, children use speech in a way which is non-intellectual, like crying out, calling for things, and it's not done in any kind of conscious way, but it's demanding mother's attention or something like that. So that's pre-intellectual speech. Pre-verbal intelligence is recognising the fact that, for example, children learn how to handle things long before they can speak. Right? So intelligence and speech have their separate roots. But the whole point of Vygotsky's investigations, in the course of development, they get tied up together. At a certain point, a child utters a word that is a meaningful word, and their intelligence now has a word on which to hang an idea, so to speak. And the development of thinking continues with interaction, and there's a complete structural alteration in the development of language and the development of thinking as that spiral goes on, and eventually get to a point on the red at the top there where we think without words. But a young child doesn't think without words. They're not still waters flowing deep, right? Well, they have certain thoughts, but they're not sophisticated. They're pre-intellectual thoughts. And then, they talk to themselves, and, they're like an open book, exactly what a child's thinking, because they're vocalising it all the time. And then gradually the vocalisations die away, and they're talking to themselves, they're instructing themselves, the words go inwards. And a lot of our thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm just some sort of freak on my own, but I have a lot of conversations in my head, both with friendly people and antagonists, and all the discussions have been happening here today. I've had all these arguments over the past couple of weeks inside my head. Do other people have this experience too? Yeah, thank you. I'm not alone. In fact, I think I'm saying there's two people. One person is this utter anarchist, but this is the first thing that comes into his head. He's totally politically incorrect. He's just really straight from the gut. And the other person's a kind of super ego. There's no, don't say that. Or what about this objection? Right? So we have this thinking that goes on in form of words, which is, you couldn't be an intelligent human being without this stuff going on. But the fact is, quite often, I'll go to bed and wake up in the morning with an idea, right? That I do a lot of thinking and problem solving that doesn't involve any words at all. But the point is, does that mean I was born with that ability to solve problems without words? I would say, as a Vygotsky, is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. But through the development of the intellect in a verbal culture, through discourse, I learn to command myself, tell myself what to do, remind myself of things. I take other people that I know that have a particular point of view, particularly sharp, I incorporate them in my thinking. They argue with me inside. So you develop this verbal kind of thinking, but at a certain point there's also thinking that goes beyond that. Right? So you have thinking without words, and of course we all occasionally do words without thinking, don't we?
Do you mean spoken words?
Sorry?
Do you mean spoken words?
No, I mean internal words. But
thinking without internal words.
Yeah. And there can be, it's a long-standing issue in philosophy that goes back centuries about the nature of thought, and a wide spread of opinion that would agree that thought is like internal talking in some way. A lot of people observe that thinking is involved, is related to talking to yourself. Okay, but many other people will say, no, there's plenty of thinking that goes on that isn't talking to yourself. You can't just say it's talking to yourself, and it isn't, because in the process of development, thinking goes beyond those internal arguments.
Probably links in with the research on sleep. Promote.
Yeah. Well, research aside, I don't know, but it's certainly a lot of problem solving goes on with me through sleep, no doubt about it. There's a great passage. This link is giving you to, which goes to Vygotsky's most famous, best work, Thinking and Speech. He's talking here about thinking and speech. And he says, in the ontogenetic means in the development of an individual being, right? In the ontogenetic development, thought and speech have different roots. Okay? In the speech development of the child, we can with certainty establish a pre-intellectual stage, and in his thought development, a pre-linguistic stage. So children are thinking even before they have language, but it's very limited thinking. Up to a certain point in time, the two follow different lines independently of each other. At a certain point, these lines meet, whereupon thought becomes verbal and speech rational. So that's just the first meeting point in that spiral. And he goes on to follow that spiral considerably further.
So I guess thinking beyond words opens up tool use.
Opens up
tool use.
This question of tools we'll come to on another day. It's a very, very complex question, which I've been sweating over a lot because I knew I couldn't come and talk to this group until I was completely clear on it, like with the matter and consciousness thing. But we'll devote some time to that, right? One of the things that it does lead us to is the question of unity and dichotomy. So, for example, taking tools and signs, the general category. Take this as an example. if we talk about tools and signs, is this a dualism? And if it's not, can someone tell me why I'm not having a dualism here? We're all clear why dualism is a dirty word. Yeah? And it is today. Dualism is a dirty word, where you say there are two types of people in this world: those that understand dualism and those that don't. That's what dualism is, and it's generally regarded as a bad thing ever since about the 1960s. Up to 1960s on, you're allowed to be dualist, but now it's not allowed. It's one of those things you can't do. But tools and signs, do they constitute a dualism? Yes.
So can you elaborate on that background?
The dualism is a new thing to you? Oh, okay. Look, the story with dualism begins with René Descartes in the 17th century, who was the first person to make an object of consciousness, to think about consciousness. Previously to then, no one thought of sort of thinking consciousness, let's talk about that. Right? They talked about people, behaviour, ideas or whatever, but Descartes said consciousness because he was a mathematician, and one of the jobs he used to do as a mathematician with his coordinate geometry, with parabolas and things, that he could write little equations that would tell a cannoneer what angle to point his cannon at to get the cannonball over the castle wall. Right? Now this posed a problem. How could he do little sums on a bit of paper that knew better the trajectory of an iron cannonball than the experienced cannoneer? Right? So what was the connection between these fantasies we've already discussed, right? These phantoms in his mind that allowed him to chuck numbers around on a bit of paper, and the firing of a cannonball through the wall. So he posed the problem, right? And the established critique of him was he made a problem for himself by setting up a dualism, that there was thought over there and matter, right? And he considered thought as if it was like a substance. It was one of the... By substance, he doesn't mean like something that's flowing around. There's the two basic things in the world. There are material things and thought objects. Right? So once you've set up the problem like that, you're not going to be able to solve it. Right? Now, if you're into gender politics, if you haven't wandered into it by accident, it will happen to you one day. If you just think there are men and women in this world, someone, a luminator, is going to straighten you out and say there are not. There are many, many different shades. Right? Likewise, we have a talk about humans and animals and the difference between them and how you do it. It just doesn't stand up. There are too many human beings who, unfortunately, never get beyond the level of animal life, and some wonderful animals that behave the hell like that crow that goes skiing on YouTube. To anyone seen that? It's just bloody amazing. A crow that's having fun skiing down a roof on someone's hubcap. You know? So every time you try and say there are two kinds of X in the world, these X are like that and these not X are like that, it falls over, right? Because once you create this division of two different kinds of thing, it begs the question of how, it begs in fact a mediation between the two, of the basis of the division. And that's the other little symbol that, when you get sort of Zen symbolism, is to represent this fact that when you make a dichotomy, there's always, it's creating a relationship between two things, and there's an implied unity. If you make a dichotomy between human beings and animals, and we are all animals. And so on what basis, human beings are animals, apart from everything else, right? If you make a dichotomy of men and women, you're making it on the basis of sexuality, but sexuality is very multiple, yes.
I think it would help to explain why you would ever consider tools and signs as a dichotomy.
Okay, well, a tool is an instrument for working on nature. A sign is the instrument for working on the mind. Looks like two different kinds of things. Something's either a tool for working on nature, or if it's a sign for communicating or working on the mind. Why isn't that a dichotomy?
Don't think in terms of that dichotomy, and that's possibly a problem.
Yeah, but if you say tool and I'm challenging you, obviously. I'm saying you can deny you think that way, but you're the person that said tool and sign.
Well, didn't you introduce the question, are tools and signs a dichotomy to us?
Yeah. I'm suggesting...
So people were questioning, well,
yes.
what's going on there? And you kind of answered that by saying, well, the dichotomy is this, but I think digging a bit deeper into the original question, the question might be saying, well, why would you ever pose that tools and signs were a dichotomy? Okay,
well, I'm going to have to sort of play the role of a devil's advocate here a bit to make the point that there is an issue.
Would be helpful,
a tool is by definition an artifact whose purpose is to work on nature, the material world. Right? It's directed outwards. A sign is directed inwards. That's to say, if I use a sign, it doesn't in any way change any material object. It's to change either my own mind, by I'm reading a book and I learn about something, or to change someone else's mind, I send them an email message and they understand what I'm thinking. Changes the mind.
Extension of the matter-thought dichotomy is
Yeah.
what you understand that to be.
On the email thing we've got, except word, someone said something that I thought was really good the other day about that issue, and he said that basically was that if I make something, put it outside my shop, tell people that I've got something inside to buy, that's a tool. But them seeing that to know that there's something in my shop is a sign. So it depends on which side of the thing. If it's something that I have produced to put out there, or it's something that someone is seeing that I have produced.
If you put something outside your shop to demonstrate to someone, to the public, if you like, you're selling them, you're using it as a sign.
Yeah. So the same tool is now a sign.
Yeah, okay. So, that is a good answer. What you're saying is that I can take one and the same thing and I can use it functionally as a sign or functionally as a technical tool.
Yes.
Right? So it's not a dichotomy because you're making a distinction about the use to which something has happened, and that if I wanted to get all the things in the world and start sorting them into signs over there, tools over there, I would come to this object that the gentleman put outside his shop and I'd say, goodness me, I don't know which side to put it on. Right? The thing is that the tool-sign distinction is a functional distinction, and it's a valid distinction, and one must be clear about the difference, that whether the tool's put outside the shop for the purpose of changing minds or it's being used to dig a hole. In there are two different
functions. People up on the sidewalk.
Yeah, that's right. That would be a tool then.
I'm curious to know whose idea was it that it was the dichotomy anyway. This is what I'm puzzled about, because it doesn't seem to be a dichotomy to me.
It doesn't seem to be a dichotomy. Well, the way it's formulated in some of Vygotski's work, it really looks like a dichotomy because he's insisting on the distinction. And he was writing in the early 1930s when, for instance, one didn't have computers which generate signs that can be operating a lathe just as well as talking to a person. Though I must admit, the example of putting a tool outside the shop is a great simple example.
I was thinking that a sign, if you want to stop traffic, the best way is with a sign, and I would say that's a perfect tool for stopping traffic. A sign that says stop, or a stop sign, which is a hand. Put up your hand, that's a sign. Yeah, but it's aimed at changing minds, isn't it? Causing the driver to put their foot on the brake, so to speak. Sorry? A sign saying stop, or even that gesture, is intended to change the mind of the driver. Let's say the driver came from a country where this was a way of saying hello. Wouldn't work, would it? The tool fails, yes. Yeah, but see, it's not a tool, it's a sign. Oh, I call it a tool. It's a cultural tool. No, this is... see, Vygotsky gets quite heated about this, and it's very fashionable today to use this word tool as an all-inclusive thing. You can say this concept is a tool for teaching, or this gesture is a tool for controlling traffic. Right? The point is that there is a distinction between changing a mind and changing material, and it's an important distinction. And the fact is that you could get run down because you thought that was a tool. Actually, it's a sign. No, you get run down because you misunderstand the sign. Yes. But it's still a tool either way. Well, so the point is that what I'm trying to do here is introduce a set of concepts as they exist in a specific body of theory. And a lot of these things have different words mean different things in different
theories. But this particular distinction is one in which the founder of the science, Vygotsky, got very heated about, because he said a tool also operates on the mind, but it operates differently. Right? A sign operates on the mind in a specific way it's intended to, and it operates directly on the mind. Right? A tool operates on the mind as well. For example, in my youth, getting a car was a great thing, right? It changed your whole psychology, because suddenly you could get out all over town, go and have a party down in St Kilda or whatever, right? It changed your whole psychology as a tool, right? It was also maybe a symbol, right? Especially the type of car you had, but its function as a tool changed the mind in a specific way. So Vygotsky was very insistent that we recognise the different function of artefacts and how they act on the mind. That a tool changes the mind because it changes our activity, and through our activity then our consciousness changes. But a sign acts directly on the mind, consciousness. And in this particular stream of theory, it's important. Now, it's actually worth making a fuss over, because I read a paper a while ago that actually got published, where the person was using the word artefact to mean basically anything. You know, like the theory of gravity was an artefact, anything you like. And I spoke to her by email, said, why are you doing this? She said, well, this is how it is in activity theory. People just call anything artefact. It's part of the terminology of activity theory. Missing the fact that artefact is a perfectly meaningful word. It's something that is made by people. It's a made by human art, right? And it's a material thing that participates in human activity, and that's why activity theorists talk about it. And we're not saying everything is an artefact, right? So the person caught up in the modern idea of, you know, like the news, what is it? This meeting will be a great tool for improving social cohesion, right? You can say anything can be a tool, but that's all very well if it happens to be fashionable to call everything a tool. But it obscures distinctions which are very important in this specific branch of science.
I agree, but I'm wondering, and looking at your explanation of dichotomy in the wiki as well helps, I think, to clarify that, because often it will be qualified as a mediational artifact, which then kind of positions it as either mediating the mind or mediating the material. I agree with you that artifact can be a sloppy word, but at the same time, if it's a mediational artifact, so it's positioned within the system, then it becomes clear, is it mediating the mind or is it mediating the material? Would you agree?
Yeah,
I think that's...
so we're unfortunately using up a lot of the material for later talks and running out of time to complete the material I had for this one. You're quite right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stall that, because I've got 4 minutes to say, yes, sorry, Jean.
Is your point that although dualism seemed to be a no-no, in this case it's important?
No, dualism was always a mistake, right? And tool and sign are not a dualism, in fact, because, as Gavin quite rightly pointed out, the one and the same thing can be a tool at one moment, a sign at the next. Therefore, it's not an idea which you can sort everything in the world into two kinds,
Sure.
because it's a functional distinction.
Yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to clarify what you were...
Yeah, dualism was always wrong, but it's an accusation that was often thrown around very carelessly, right?
Thank you.
We're not going to have time to deal with this. I wanted to talk about unity, because unity is a word that is used a lot by people in chat, and it's not well understood. What I'm going to do is postpone that to when we get back to talking about signs and tools. I'll try and squeeze in something about unity.
You can look it up on the online dictionary.
Absolutely.
As well.